Hello and welcome to lecture part 2 for module 5. This is going to be a pretty quick lecture, but we didn't have time to fit it in during our regular Monday lecture, hence why we're having a quick part 2. So there's only two topics for this lecture. One is the New York Statewide Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment. That is a very long title for what is commonly referred to as the New York State Child Abuse Hotline, or a lot of people just call it the hotline. We're also going to have a very quick discussion of mandated reporters in New York State. So let's get started. The New York State Child Abuse Prevention Act of 1973 was a landmark law for New York State. Prior to 1973, we had child protective services in the state, but it was really ad hoc. It wasn't really well organized. It wasn't the same in every county. It didn't have the same funding streams. So the Child Abuse Prevention Act of 1973 decided it was going to fix that. And there's three really important elements of this law that you need to know. The first is that this law created the Child Abuse Hotline. So you know the hotline's been in existence since 1973. The second thing the law did was it required every single county in New York State, including Manhattan and the boroughs, and every other county from the North Country to Buffalo to the Southern Tier, to have a Child Protective Services CPS unit in every county. Outside of New York State, every CPS is located within the county's Department of Social Services. In New York City, we have the Administration for Children's Services located in Manhattan, which oversees all the boroughs, and there is a CPS in every one of the boroughs. So this law required that, and every county very quickly complied. And the third thing the Child Abuse Prevention Act of 1973 did was it created mandated reporters. This was the first time that the New York State Legislature said the reporting of suspected child abuse and neglect is so important. We're going to require people based on their profession to be required by law to report suspected child abuse and neglect. And we'll talk about each one of these topics in more detail. The first is the SCR. Again, the long name is the New York Statewide Central Register of Child Abuse and Maltreatment, commonly referred to as the SCR for Statewide Central Register, or the Child Abuse Hotline. And what it is it is a very large call center where people answer calls where either mandated reporters or just regular people like you and I call the hotline to report suspected child abuse or neglect. The SCR is open, and it's open because it's required by law to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. This makes it a lot different than a lot of other state agencies, right? And state offices. You know, the DMV closes at 5 o'clock. The tax department closes at 5 o'clock. Well, the child abuse hotline can't close at 5 o'clock, and it has to be open every weekend because the law says it is required to be open 24/7, 365. And there are no exceptions for natural disasters such as flooding or hurricanes that we experience. The hotline has to remain open. The hotline remained open through the entirety of the disaster of 9/11 with the terrorist attacks. It remained open throughout the great blackout of the Northeast that happened in the summer of 2003, where about 9 states, including New York, lost most of our power. No matter what happens, the SCR has to be open because it's required by law to be open 24/7, 365. So how many reports do you think the SCR takes in a year? Remember, the SCR is covering the entire state of New York, including New York City. So how many reports do you think they get in a year? Well, in 2019, they got 195,000, and that's about average. Almost 200,000 reports a year are accepted by the SCR. So child abuse and neglect has a different definition in every state. Every state gets to decide what qualifies as child neglect and child abuse in their own state. In New York State, we divide child maltreatment into two categories. The first thing you need to know is the SCR can only accept reports against parents and other people who are legally responsible for children. So if a stranger to a child hits, punches, kicks, or sexually assaults a child that is a stranger to them, the SCR cannot take a report. That is a case that must be reported to law enforcement. Because by law, the SCR can only accept reports against parents and other people who are legally responsible for children. The second criteria for the SCR to take a report is the allegations must meet the legal definition of child neglect or abuse. And this is how it's defined in New York State. Neglect is a failure to meet the minimum degree of care. That's the legal standard, minimum degree of care. If a parent or other person legally responsible for a child fails to meet the minimum degree of care and the child's mental, emotional, or physical condition is harmed, then that is neglect in New York State. This is what the textbook describes as passive maltreatment. Abuse in New York State has a very limited definition. For a child to be abused under the New York State law, the child was subjected to the most serious acts of physical abuse that resulted in the child's death, near death, permanent injury, or disfigurement. And our abuse definition also includes sexual abuse. So, for a parent to be charged with abuse in New York State, it means they committed the most serious acts of violence against that child, including causing their death, causing their near death, causing them to have a protracted or permanent physical injury, and that definition also includes sexual abuse. New York State is what we call state operated and county investigated for child protective services. And this is how that works. The New York State, underlined state, Office of Children and Family Services operates the SCR and accepts those 195,000 reports every year. So the state operates the child abuse hotline. However, the state doesn't investigate cases of child abuse. What happens is the SCR accepts those reports and sends it to the appropriate county's Child Protective Services unit for investigation. So the hotline is state operated, but CPS investigations are done at the county level. So they are performed by child protective caseworkers who are employed by the county, by the Department of Social Services. And once CPS gets a report from the SCR, they have 60 days to complete their investigation. So there's a big difference between what CPS can do, what action they can take against a parent, versus what the police can do and what actions they can take against a parent. So let's look at CPS first. If a parent neglects or abuses their child, CPS, Child Protective Services, can only bring a case against the parent in family court. That is the only jurisdiction they can use, is the family court. So what can the family court do? Well, the family court can supervise a parent. The family court can issue orders of protection. They can require a parent to complete services, and they also have the power to place a child in foster care. In the most extreme cases, and after protracted court proceedings, and by protracted, I mean that take a year and a half, 2 years or more, a parent's rights can be terminated. That is extremely rare statistically. If a parent has involvement with CPS, it is much more likely that they will be issued an order of protection or required to complete services. Statistically, it's rare for a child to be placed in foster care, and it's extremely rare for a parent's rights to that child to be terminated. So that's what CPS can do. That's the actions they can take against a parent who abuses or neglects their child. The police is an entire different matter. Only police in New York State can arrest a parent or charge them with a crime for neglecting or abusing their child. The district attorney will then decide if the case will be brought to trial in criminal court. Remember, we had a question on an earlier quiz about who gets to make a decision on whether cases are brought to trial. And that is entirely up to the district attorney, whether it's for child abuse or child neglect, burglary, robbery, rape, arson, or any other crime. It is solely within the district attorney's jurisdiction to decide if a case is brought to trial. If a parent who's abused or neglected their child is convicted in criminal court, or they plead guilty to charges of abuse or neglect, they can be sentenced to probation, jail time, or prison. Okay, so that's the difference between what CPS can do and what the police can do in New York State regarding child abuse and neglect. We're going to move to a different topic. Now we're going to talk about mandated reporters. Remember that Child Protective Services law in 1973 created mandated reporters of child abuse and neglect. In New York State, anyone, any person can make a call to the SCR to report that they have suspicions a child is being neglected or abused. The person who calls doesn't need to be able to prove that a child is being abused or neglected. They simply have to have a reasonable suspicion a child's being abused or neglected to make a call to the SCR. However, mandated reporters are much different. New York State has designated specific people who are required by law to report their suspicions a child's being abused or neglected, and we call them mandated reporters because they're mandated to call the SCR. All of these peoples are licensed or certified by the state to practice their profession. Or, in some cases like daycare workers, they work for a place that's licensed by New York State. So that's how New York State can select specific people and say you are required by law to call the SCR if you have suspicions of child abuse or neglect. It's because New York State issued their certificate or license to practice their profession. And there are a lot of mandated reporters in New York State. In fact, there are 42 professions in New York State that are designated as mandated reporters. Here's just 18. A lot of them are exactly what you would think of. We have a lot of medical people, physicians, surgeons, dentists, nurse, a lot of medical people are required to be mandated reporters. It also includes first responders, such as police officers and EMTs, and as you probably guessed, an awful lot of people who work in schools. So anyone who is licensed to teach in New York State is a mandated reporter, but also so is every school official. And school officials include people like principals, assistant principals, and guidance counselors. Many people who work in the mental health field are also mandated reporters of child abuse and neglect, including social workers, psychologists, therapists. People who work for the Department of Social Services, whether they work in foster care or they are general social services worker, are also mandated reporters, as are people who work in licensed daycares. So, if you work in any of these professions, you are a mandated reporter of child abuse and neglect. So, what if you don't report suspicions of child abuse and neglect when you're a mandated reporter? Well, in New York State, it can be pretty serious. A mandated reporter who has a reasonable suspicion of child neglect or abuse and does not report it to the SCR can face both criminal and civil liability. Criminal liability, and that mandated reporter can be charged for failure to report in criminal court, which is a Class A misdemeanor. And there's also civil liability. So the mandated reporter can be sued in civil court for failure to report which caused harm to a child. So we know in criminal court the charges could result in a person having probation, jail time, Class A misdemeanor, up to a year in jail, right? Also up to $1,000 fine, and that creates a criminal record. So that's something that person's going to have to report and report on job applications for the rest of their life. Civil lawsuits. So what's the penalty if you get sued in civil court? Well, the most common judgment in civil court is a monetary judgment. It's money. So a mandated reporter could be sued for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in civil court. And The school that you work for or the daycare center or whatever it is not going to indemnify you. They're not going to protect you if you are named in a civil lawsuit. So your name is actually going to appear on that lawsuit and you will be sued personally. So this is very serious for mandated reporters. If they don't call when they have a reasonable suspicion, they can be charged criminally or civilly. Those are very stiff penalties. So when the Office of Children and Family Services does training for mandated reporters, they always instruct mandated reporters, just make the call. If a mandated reporter makes a call to the SCR, they cannot be sued by the parents. They cannot be charged criminally for making a false report, even if the allegations turn out not to be true. So, the best course of action for every mandated reporter is to simply call the SCR whenever they have a reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect. Because if they don't, and as a result of them not calling, the child is harmed, the consequences can be very serious, not only for the child, but for the mandated reporter. So that's it. That's your very short lecture part 2. If you have any questions on any of these topics in the video or in any part of the module, please send me an email.